Welcome to tonight's program, Warsaw Ghetto Resistance. I am Linda Lador, Program Co-Coordinator, along with Yvette Schlessel for the East Brunswick chapter of Hadassah. Many thanks to the East Brunswick Public Library and adult programming planner Melissa Hosick for co-sponsoring this event. We live in a world where facts don't matter and young people are increasingly less knowledgeable about the Holocaust. According to a 2023 economic YouGov poll, at least 20% of young Americans think that the Holocaust was a myth. In a 2020 survey, the U.S. Millennial Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness Survey, nearly 20% of millennials and Gen Z believe that Jews caused the Holocaust. Many think that the number of victims was exaggerated. The Warsaw Ghetto was established by the Nazis in 1940 and was the largest of all Nazi-occupied Jewish ghettos during World War II, confining over 400,000 Jews to a 3.4-mile area. About 90% of the inhabitants perished, succumbing to disease, starvation, and mass deportation to extermination camps. As Rochel Auerbach, survivor and chronicler of the ghetto, said, "Now I realize that armed resistance and cultural activism were not distinct from one another, but two sides of the same coin, an affirmation of life in the face of death, and part of our struggle for humanity, beauty, wisdom, strength, and spirit." Hadassah welcomes back Deborah Rosenberg, Holocaust educator, here to give us facts about the Warsaw Ghetto resistance and increase our knowledge of the various forms that resistance took. Mrs. Rosenberg holds a master's degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Yeshiva University. She's enrolled in a doctoral program at Touro University in Judaic Studies. And please put your questions in the chat for the end. Okay, Deborah, we look forward to hearing your talk.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining. So I'm going to be talking about the Warsaw Ghetto resistance, and I wanted to give some kind of historical background in so far as how this whole issue started with specifically Germany. And the first thing that came to me was the fact that it really began at the end of World War I. And there were reasons for that. The Germans were one of the losers in World War I, and based on the treaty that they signed, they were forced to pay high financial penalties. At the same time, they had land that had belonged to them, which was used to recreate Poland, and they were like any other country, they don't want to lose land. In addition, their economy was non-existent pretty much, and they were getting American loans, which stopped when the 29 crash of the stock exchange happened. So all in all, their economic state was in terrible, just in terrible condition, and the people couldn't buy food and they couldn't buy other things that they need, or the price was outrageous and the prices kept going up. And there was a lot of resentment in the country, and a lot of people were unhappy with what was going on. Um, and that's how the Nazis began to gain popularity within Germany, because the German people saw that nothing was changing, and there was a sense that perhaps um, new leadership would help them recover economically, and they could start living a better life. Um, so in 1933, we have Paul von Hindenburg, who was the head of the Weimar Republic, appointing Hitler as chancellor. So this is the beginning of Hitler's involvement, and he proceeds to use it to the best of his advantage. There was something called the Enabling Act of 1933, which gave Hitler significant power, and there was no oversight by any other body of government. So, for all intents and purposes, von Hindenburg had no power, and Hitler was the one with all the power, and nobody was there to stop whatever he wanted to do. Hindenburg died about a year after that, and then Hitler merged the offices of president and chancellor. So basically, he held all the offices. When he started ruling, he was able to get the economy rolling by deciding that despite what the Versailles Agreement said, he was going to begin to plan for another war. And um, preparing for a war is something that makes the economy get better, because you're producing different machinery, I don't know, guns and tanks, and people had jobs and people were being paid, and the people were happy. I mean, it was not clear yet as to uh, all the things he was going to do in the future, but the Germans knew that the economy was better. They were able to live like regular people, and they were happy with the situation. Um, Now, Hitler was not happy with the fact that Germany had lost territory as a result of the Versailles Treaty, and in March of 38, they annexed Austria. So one is beginning to get a sense of what some of his goals are. He starts off with Austria, and then he goes and he takes Sudetenland, um, which was given to him as part of the Munich conference. So he's already extended Germany to some extent, and that's part of his overall plan is to um, have Germany take over as much land and as many countries as possible. Um, So he's preparing for war, okay, and it's mid-August 1939. One thing that Hitler worried about was having to deal with the Russians or the Soviets at that time, and they signed the what is called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, which which basically said if Germany starts a war with Poland and they win, then Germany will agree to give part of Poland to the Soviets, and they'll keep part of um, the land themselves. So this way, the Soviets got more land, and Germany also stood the chance of getting more land. Underneath it all, I believe, based on what I know, that Hitler had no intentions of leaving the situation like that, having the Soviets occupy half of Poland. But for the time being, it solved his problem, and everybody was happy with what they got. Okay, now the Germans began the war, and they had a lot of artillery. They had a lot of planes and guns and all kinds of other arms, I guess. Um, they attacked Warsaw starting on September 2nd, 1939. Um, Now, the Polish Air Force and the Polish Army were called in, but they were no match for Hitler. Um, it was like they had never imagined that Hitler would be able to build up his army and air force to such an extent that the Poles could not defend themselves. But the truth of the matter is, it was really just about not a battle at all. Um, on September 16th, um, which happened to be Rosh Hashanah, the German bombers uh, bombed the Warsaw's Jewish quarter, and they knew exactly where the Jewish quarter was. That wasn't a ghetto, it was just where the Jews lived. Um, the other thing you should note is that this happened on Rosh Hashanah. And you'll see just within the story of Warsaw, without looking at any of the other ghettos, that a lot of their offensive actually took place on Jewish holidays, be it Rosh Hashanah, be it Passover, be it Yom Kippur. Those were the times that they liked to attack the Jews. Um, because that, so now we're going to put the treaty between the Germans and the Soviets into effect, due to the fact that the Nazis were conquering Poland. Stalin's Red Army marched into their part of Poland, and not in a military way, but more under the guise of uh, keeping things under under control, and this was their prize for not interfering with the Germans. Now, so this was 1939. The Jewish ghetto didn't begin until 1940. So there was a little over a year, in which nothing, I mean, there were things that were happening to the Jews, but there was no ghetto at the time. Um, and the Jews probably did not really believe that this ghetto would actually come to be, but it did. And the walls of the ghetto were built by the Jews, and the Jews had to pay for it, which is a fairly typical thing for the Germans to do. The Germans had to pay for the damage uh, of Kristallnacht as well. So this is just how a double punishment for what they did. Now, The Jews represented about a third of the Warsaw population of about 900,000 people. And when the ghetto was built, they they got 2.5% of the city's total area. So they were 33% of the people, and they got 2.5% of the total area. So they were really squashed together, one on top of the other. And as typical of most ghettos, the ghetto is in the worst part of the city. And around this time, the Germans also established the Judenrat, and Adam Cherniakov was the head of the Judenrat. The Judenrat was really, in case you're not familiar with the term, was sort of the go-between between the Nazis and the Jews. The Nazis would tell the Judenrat what they wanted, and the Judenrat was supposed to give the news over to the Jews, which wasn't the most pleasant job for them. Um, Now the question became like for the Jews how they were going to sustain themselves. Um, so a committee was established called Alei Nilf, or Jewish Self-Help, whose director was Emanuel Ringelblum, and he ran this committee along with a joint distribution committee. And they were responsible for things like soup kitchens and getting food into the ghetto to the degree that they could. And this was very important because food became a very big issue. And one of the causes of death was simply, not having enough food. Now, Emanuel Ringelblum, whose name may be familiar, was also in charge of what they call the Onik Shabbos. Um, uh, he he actually created the idea of Onik Shabbos. It was a kind of a secret group of people that collected information of everything that was going on in the ghetto. And that would include newspapers or letters or signs or whatever there was. And they used to meet on Shabbos afternoon to share what they found. And the purpose of this was as proof, like Linda said before, like people say it didn't really happen. Well, Ringelblum didn't want people to be able to say that, and therefore he wanted to retain proof of really what was going on. Um, Towards the ends of the ghetto, re- when everybody realized that the ghetto was not going to last, Ringelblum hid all the papers in uh, three separate containers, and he buried them. Two of these containers were located after the war. One is still missing, but I don't think they've given up hope of finding it. Some people say that it's under the Chinese mission in Warsaw, but I think that will be hard to prove or find, but hopefully they will locate it at some future points. And Rachel Auerbach, who Linda was talking about before, was another member of the Onik Shabbos and one of the few members that actually survived. Um, so Alain Nilf was able to supply a certain amount of food, but as time went on, the need for food became greater and greater. And the way that some of the food was gotten was through smuggling, and a lot of the smugglers were actually kids because they could get through like holes in the wall or something. They were small enough, and they would go and they would get some food. Obviously, not enough food, but at least a little more than what was allotted to them by um, the joint and anybody that was involved in the soup kitchens. Now, in Poland, at let's say before, somewhat before the war started, a lot of the Jews still lived in fairly primitive conditions in shtetls and places like that, where there was not a lot of opportunity for them to move ahead. Shtetls were usually quite poor. Um, there was very little opportunity to get into any kind of real business or go to university and study. So um, they got involved in different groups, mostly having to do with going to Israel. And there were several of these groups, and they had somewhat different philosophies. And I guess the people picked the ones that they probably felt most comfortable with. But in this way, first of all, they were able to socialize, and they were able to have a feeling that there was some kind of future. So there was, for instance, Hashomer Hatzair, and they were a socialist Zionistic group that really prioritized Hebrew education and preparation to emigrate to Palestine. So they had activities that they thought would be similar to what they would have to do when they actually got to Palestine, which was, cultivating the land and things like that. Um, and that was something that the youth was very involved in. Then there was Beitar. It was a revisionist Zionist group, but they believed more in self-defense and militarism. So it trained them for a Jewish state, and it trained them to fight, which isn't the typical Jewish training, but these people felt that that was important. There was another organization called Dror, and that was a labor Zionist movement, and it had socialistic ideas, and they were focused on a kibbutz type of life. I think there were a few more. There was Hanoar HaIvri Akiva. That was a religious Zionistic group, active in traditional Jewish values, education, and also pioneering. There was Hechalutz, focused on training young Jews for agricultural work, and they overlap with other Zionistic groups. The Bund, which is a group in and of itself, affiliated with the Socialist Jewish Labor Bund. It organized apprentices for different areas. It emphasized Yiddish culture, did not emphasize Hebrew. They weren't particularly Zionistic, and they kind of were more like Soviet oriented, and they were very different from the other youth groups. These groups were important to the fact that when these people were forced into the ghetto, uh, many of these groups actually got together to form uh, to form groups in order to protect and help the ghetto. So they were called the ZOB. Now the ZOB stands for certain Polish words, which, to be honest, I cannot pronounce. So we will call it the ZOB, in English, the Jewish Fighting Organization. They played a major role in active resistance, and it included members of Shomer Hatzair, Dror, Akiva, etc. Um, the other major group was called the ZZW, which also stands for some words that I do not know in Polish, but they were more related to the military end of things, and um, they they were very focused on, for instance, getting arms. They weren't involved in food, but they wanted to protect the Jews via um, arms as opposed to um, other methods, or they did not buy the story that by listening to what the Nazis told them to do, that they would be saved. They believed that um, at the end they would not survive, and they preferred to die. If they had to die, they preferred to die fighting than not. Um, the ZZW included members of Beitar. They believed in Jewish self-defense and militarism. They actually smuggled arms into the ghetto, not food, but arms. And they trained their members how to use them, because if you don't practice and you can't use it, it's not very helpful. It established contact with the Polish underground, which functioned outside the Warsaw Ghetto, and some of the Polish officers. Um, they were ideologically right wing with strong ties to pre war Polish military. They were better armed than the ZOB because they had they were involved in arms even before the war, and since they had a relationship with the Polish underground, they were able to get from them some machine guns, rifles, and grenades. But the Polish underground was not as helpful as it could have been, partly because they saw Jews as not as fighters, and they didn't have a lot of faith that by giving over these guns and other ammunition, that that was actually going to be used. And I guess they were, they were in short supply. Um, so you have differing ideologies between these two main groups, the ZOB and the ZZW. Now, one of the things that the ZOB would do in terms of resistance, okay, it was non-military resistance. One thing that you could do was you could be a courier. Being a courier meant that let's say you wanted to get certain documents to some other city or somebody in some other city. Okay, the only way to do it was you can send it by mail. The only way to do it was to actually send someone to that city with the documents hidden on their person in some fashion. And they would go to the other city and find whoever it was their contact was, give them the information, and then come back and have to get back into the ghetto. Some of the risks that they faced, first of all, they had to get out of the ghetto. That was number one. They usually traveled by train. So if you're on a train, you really don't know who else will be on the train. So you could have instances where there were Nazis on the train who might start to bother you. Um, Another problem, which was a big problem, was you may meet a Pole that you know, and they may recognize you. And unfortunately, a lot of these Poles would then give you up to the Nazis because they would get some kind of monetary reward. So you really had to be quite careful, and it was very risky. And you were doing this both going there and coming back. And sometimes you were sent to a city which you really didn't know, and you had to find somebody, and you weren't even quite sure where they lived, and you couldn't really ask people. So, and you couldn't be seen as like being like not knowing where you're going. So they faced a lot of risks, and typically it was the women who went. Um, a lot of women, especially if they were blonde, they had less risk, and their Polish was usually quite good. Oftentimes better than that of the men, since many of these men never really learned Polish because at home they spoke Yiddish. And if they went to any kind of yeshiva or anything, they spoke Yiddish. So they never really learned Polish. And as soon as they opened their mouth, you could tell that their Polish was not really Polish. So being a woman made it less risky to do this particular uh, job. When you think of like the people in the ghetto, you sort of think of them as like one mass of people, but in truth, there were a very heterogeneous lot in terms of the levels of Jewish observance. There were conservatives, there were reform, there were Litvish, there were Hasidim, and all of a sudden, and these people are very different, had very different lifestyles from each other. For people who just think of Jews as one homogeneous grouping, it's just that's not really the case. And all of a sudden, all these people with different ideologies and different ways of doing things were left to live like right on top of each other. Um, there were people who actually lived in the area where the ghetto was built. So those were the lucky ones because they didn't have to move at all. They had their apartments and they had their belongings. And then there were those who had to come from other parts of the city and bring their belongings with them and find a place to live. And when I say finding a place to live, it wasn't like they found an apartment, they found a space which could have been occupied by several other families and children, and they had to leave most of their belongings behind because they were only able to carry so much. So I guess they took what they considered the most worthwhile, either food or some other items that they were attached to, but they lost everything else. Um, and I believe most of the most of that was taken over by Germans who moved into their apartments. And this being in the ghetto actually changed the society itself, because if you were a rich Jew who lived on the other side of the city, but you couldn't take all your stuff with you, you could become one of the poor Jews, and vice versa. So the society itself was sort of in a state of flux, and there was no sense of stability, uh, in addition to all the other problems that they had to face. As described in many things that I've read, being in the ghetto was horrible. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't really any medicine. There was really not sufficient living space. Disease was rampant due to lack of medicine and lack of cleanliness, and they were harassed by the Germans, and they were oftentimes required to do hard labor. But nobody was deported. So again, there's this sense of possibly, um, okay, this is what's going to happen, but nothing worse will happen. However, while nothing was happening in the ghetto, the Germans were busy constructing Treblinka, which is not far from Warsaw. And it was basically a place, it wasn't really a camp because it was no camp. You kind of went there and you were pretty much killed immediately. So there was it wasn't a big area or anything, and it was kind of hidden in the woods. It wasn't a place that like people in general really knew about, so nobody had any idea about what was going to happen. Okay. However, there was the first deportation to Treblinka in 1942, July 42. So that means that the ghetto went into effect in November of 40. So this was like for a year and a half, they were in poor condition, but there was none of this deportation. Um, but deportation started in 42. Okay. Um, Now the Germans, as typical, this but didn't only happen in Warsaw, but the Germans told the Jews that they were going to be deported to different work sites, and most of the Jews decided that that was true. Um, One could argue that they wanted to believe it's true, and really they had no way of knowing what was in store for them. And the Germans, the Germans did this many times by making the Jews write letters to their families, etc., before they were killed, and they would say, we're fine, everything's fine. Um, if they made arrangements in advance, there were often code words in some of these letters which told the truth about what was happening, but it's not clear how much of that took place initially. So the first set of deportations in July of 42, they killed about 20,000 Jews. Um, Now, the youth groups knew a lot more about what was going on in the rest of Poland because, I mean, even take the couriers, right? They were on the trains, they saw, they heard, they could see a newspaper, and they knew that the Jews were not going off to work. They knew that they were going to be killed, um, and I don't know if the adults really believed them or not, but there were once the deportation started, I guess, there were questions of what to do, how to handle it. And I believe this was true in other ghettos as well. There were those who believed that if you listen to the Germans and you do what they say, things will turn out all right. Um, some examples of this would be like the Lodz ghetto, which was like the last existing ghetto where they actually did pick people to be deported based on what the Nazis requested, figuring that killing a few was better than having everybody die. Um, then there were those who did believe in military action, and they weren't waiting around for, listening to the Germans and being at their mercy, even though there was, in actuality, they could not fight them with, they weren't an equal army, but at least they felt they were standing up for themselves and not what they would say about Jews that they went like sheep to slaughter. They were not doing that. They were at least dying like a defending themselves. Um, so this was the ZZW who believed in the active resistance, and they were really the ones who were getting getting the ghetto ready for for the armed resistance that would come. Now, Adam Chernikav was the head of the Judenrat, and when he was asked by the Nazis to give over people, and he realized that he was giving them over to the Nazis to be killed, that was something that he could not live with, um, and he committed suicide. Now, that was not true in other ghettos. Um, the Judenrat there either convinced themselves that they could save some people or that the 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 Jews weren't really it wasn't really as bad as people thought it would be, and they would manage. But to him, the idea of sending his own people to die was um, not something that he could tolerate. Uh, Now, towards the end of August of 1942, the ZOB decided that they too had to um, do some active resistance. So while the Germans had taken away the Jews for deportation, the ZOB uh, would burn down the areas which they had lived in, so that what the Germans would do was just come in and take all the stuff that the people had, and the ZOB decided that that was not going to happen, and therefore they burned um, they burned the items. They also put up signs for resistance. Now, because there were there was this other side who really didn't believe in resistance. Some of these signs were actually torn down by the Jews because they believed that this would provoke the Nazis from to be even harder with them than they already were. So there was a lot of friction. There were some ZOB members who went to the Aryan side of Warsaw and tried to get arms there, either from the Polish underground or other ways that they could produce arms. And the final deportation in 1942 was on Yom Kippur. So you see here is another instance where the Germans took action on a day that they knew was a holy day for the Jews. It came to the point, I guess, when the ZOB and the ZZW realized that there weren't that many of them, and if they didn't work together, um, they were going to be working against themselves. So they kind of reorganized themselves so that they could be as effective as possible. Um, so the ZOB took on some military duties and some political positions, and they had an administrative branch, I guess, to keep things running in order. The political branch took the form of the Jewish National Committee, or the ZKN, which can start to be very confusing with all of this, but they supervise the activities of those involved in the military action. And the Jewish Coordinating Committee, or the ZKK, was added to the ZWW, which allowed them to join the ZOB without giving up its political autonomy. So, despite the despite the dangers that were facing the Jews at the time, there was still um, people who felt that their status was just more important than other things, even though they were willing to compromise to some extent and join together to work together. So far they've had two deportations, and on January 18th, 1943, the Germans came into the ghetto in order to have a new round of deportations. What they weren't expecting was to be met with armed resistance. And it's not like the Jewish resistors had significant arms, but just the fact that they took any action at all, I think the Nazis that was very traumatic for them. And they retreated and they did not come back that day. They came back a few days later, and they also met with active resistance. They managed to kill over 1,000 Jews and send another 5,000 to Treblinka. But because the Jews were fighting back, the Nazis were not as confident and sure as they had been in the past. These armed battles taught the Jewish resistance about tactics. They were able to see how the Germans operated and also how to make the most use of the small amount of arms that they actually had. So the Jews knew that the Germans were going to come back. And the part of the ghetto that was not going to be involved in any kind of active resistance, they all were busy building themselves underground bunkers. Some of these bunkers were actually very sophisticated. They had gas, electricity, water, toilets, and they had food, um, which they were able to get and store away. And they figured they'd be able to live in these bunkers for a while. The resistance fighters had no part in building bunkers. Um, they did not think that they were going to win the battle, but they wanted to be able to keep the battle going for as long as they could. And of course, the Germans did return in April of 43, which happened to be the first day of Passover. Um, the German police that was active in the Warsaw district is Oberfuhrer Ferdinand von Sammern-Frankenegg. Um, he was in charge, and he never told his superiors about the fact that there was armed resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, because he knew if he would, uh, they wouldn't uh, they wouldn't think too highly of him, and he certainly didn't want to lose his position. However, Himmler was not happy with what was going on in Warsaw, and this guy, von Sammern, was actually replaced by a Major General Jürgen Stroop, which is typically the name that one associates with the uh, Warsaw Ghetto. Now, the thing that did the resistance in was the fact that the Germans decided that they really their main strategy was not fighting. They were going to burn the ghetto down. Now they went street by street and burnt the buildings. And the problems were that the bunkers were affected by the smoke and they were forced out of their hiding places. And that's how they died. And this lasted for about 3 weeks. And some of the Jews managed to escape through the sewer system. About 7,000 were murdered, another 7,000 uh, deported to Treblinka. And even after the liquidation of the ghetto, there were Jews who continued to hide in the ghetto. Sometimes they attacked the German police that were on patrol. Um, and after the ghetto was liquidated, there were maybe as many as 20,000 Warsaw Jews who were hiding on the Aryan side of Warsaw. Um, Now, the Red Army, which had, which were the Soviets, who had agreed to the um, agreement with Germany that they weren't going to fight, obviously broke that agreement uh, because I don't think anybody really took it too seriously. And so they took over Warsaw on January of 45. So that means that Warsaw was occupied for a little over 6 years, and about 85% of the city had been destroyed. And that was the end of the Warsaw Ghetto and pretty much the end of Warsaw as well. And that's the story of the Warsaw Ghetto. And if there are any questions, I will try to answer them.
So if anyone has any questions, were there any survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto?
There were some survivors. Rachel Auerbach, as I pointed out, was one of them. I don't know that it was a matter of being smarter than anybody else or just being luckier or being not being at the wrong place at the wrong time. But she did manage to survive. And there were some others that survived, but really not very many.
Everyone's saying thank you so much for the informative presentation. Deborah, when was the ghetto liquidated? You said that 7,000 were murdered and 7,000 went to Treblinka. What happened to the 7,000 that were murdered?
What happened to them? That they were murdered? Why were they murdered?
No,
or
it's just as when the ghetto was liquidated, you said 7,000 were murdered and 7,000 went to
they
Treblinka.
had people coming out of the bunkers um, due to the fact that there was so much smoke. They couldn't stay there, and as they would come out of the bunkers, they would be shot by the Germans. So that's how a lot of them died. That's how they were hoping to survive, but because of the tactics that the Germans used, um, they couldn't stay in these bunkers. They couldn't breathe. So I guess they could have stayed there and been asphyxiated, but they were probably hoping that they had a better chance if they came out.
Okay, someone asked, would you be able to, do you also have information on the Lodz ghetto, Lodz? Did you do
But
any research
yes,
of that when you've been doing all this research?
yes, I do.
Because that'll have to be a future lecture then.
I can tell you
Yeah,
about Lodz. Yeah.
how many people lived in the ghetto at a time, who were helpful to the Jews in those times?
Well, it started out with about 300,000 people, I think, since they were a third of the population. So maybe it was 300,000, 350,000. There were some um, internal groups that helped, like the Joint was able to help them. And people like Ringelblum was very capable at organizing, and he used to go from house to house, and he used to organize all of the different families in these houses and give them all different tasks to try and keep things going as normally as possible. And when you have people working together, you have a better chance of um, making things work better, and that helped. There were some, um, what do they call them? Righteous Gentiles, Polish people who were helpful. There's the story of this woman who saved many, many children by taking them out of the ghetto in a knapsack, things like that. Um, my feeling is, although I don't have any statistics on this, that in general the Poles were not all that helpful. But of course, I don't want um, anybody to say that. And the truth of the matter is that a lot of Poles were also killed because when the Germans attacked initially, they didn't distinguish between Jews and Poles. They dropped bombs, they killed people, they had, machine guns, and a lot of a lot of Poles did die, and there were Poles that were sent to hard labor, and some of them died that way. So that was actually quite interesting. And to a large degree, I don't think the Poles have ever really taken any responsibility for what more they could have done to save the Jews than they actually did. Um, but they look at themselves as the victims and the Jews as well, they were also victims. We were equally victims.
Yeah.
So there are books about specific people in in Warsaw, specific Polish people who were helpful, but they were in the great minority, unfortunately. And there was not a lot of help. And um, the fact that the youth could get together and finally organize themselves to the degree that they did was an amazing feat. They knew they were going to die one way or the other. And that's what the Germans had in mind for them. I mean, they weren't transporting them to work. So the fact that they were willing to fight, I thought was, to me, that was very brave and very gave them a sense of possible hope, even though they didn't have a lot of hope.
Someone wrote, thank you, very informative. Um, was there a battle that enabled the Red Army to acquire Warsaw? Was it one battle? Was it a culmination of events?
No, I think it was a culmination of events and but they basically, were able to take over because the at that point, the Germans, who obviously didn't learn a lot from Napoleon, were very busy fighting the Soviets. Um, I think they started fighting the Soviets in maybe June, and Hitler expected it to be finished in like 3 months, which was a gross underestimation. So his army was ended up in Russia in the winter without any of the necessary clothes that they would need to keep them warm. Um, so they were very busy on that front. And I don't know how much attention they were paying to, some of these Polish towns that the Russians started taking over. Um, there was this one town that I studied that had a river that ran through it. On one side of the river was ruled by the Soviets, and the other side of the river was ruled by the Germans. And the people didn't know which side was the better side to be on. And you saw people moving from one to the other and vice versa. But once they started with the Soviets, I don't know that they were so active there, in Poland per se. So they focused on the Soviets in the sense of a war. And the other thing that they kept doing was deporting Jews wherever they found them. And it didn't matter that they were obviously losing this war and that what they should have been doing to win the war was to get as much manpower over to the Soviet side as possible. They wasted resources on deporting Jews to, the different camps, or either to kill them or to work them or whatever. Um, I was in Germany once. I was in Berlin, and they have a track, like a railroad track, and on each vertical horizontal strip, in that track, they have a date and how many Jews were deported on that date. And it goes on through 1944, maybe even a little into 45. They're deporting 4 people, 6 people, 8 people. I mean, they still have to use resources for them. They still had to have trains for them. They and they were willing to do that. And that's part of what helped them lose the war. I mean, they probably would have lost anyway, but it's amazing to think that with what everything that was going on, they were still focused on getting rid of as many Jews as possible. So
Someone is asking, so we know a lot of people were murdered or deported. What happened to the community people that remained? They moved together in any sort of way? What happened to those people who were able to make through everything, that were not, was anyone left behind? What happened to them? And also, where did these deported people move on to?
there weren't really many because they were either those people in the bunkers or the people who were the armed resistance. There was nothing in between. The people in the bunkers, maybe there were a few that survived. I don't know. But the majority of them did not. And the majority of the fighters did not. They were just overpowered. Um, so there wasn't like a bulk of people from the ghetto itself that survived. There were Jews outside the ghetto who were living, I guess, as non-Jews or pretending to be non-Jews. But within the ghetto itself, you didn't have like a mass of people who, what are they going to do with them?
Out of curiosity, does anybody in the audience have relatives that were in the Warsaw Ghetto? So they said to ask, that was a question to ask the chat. Does anyone have ancestry tied to that area and to that time in any way? So we'll see what that happens. Someone said yes. So
and do
you
they
have two. So
know
one
the
said yes.
story?
One said my father-in-law. Yeah, do you guys have those stories? Do you have them documented somewhere to make sure that they are preserved for future generations? Because as we've learned, that's sometimes oral history that needs to be turned to written history to be saved. My grandmother, we lost all.
It's not atypical for survivors not to speak about what happened to them, especially to their children. Sometimes they will speak to the following generation. But I would ask anybody who has the opportunity to speak to a survivor to get their story, talk to them, video them, whatever information you can get. Find out, how did they feel? How did they think? What did they do? What did they do? All of this information is like just important, and it preserves the fact that they existed, they lived, they suffered, and they survived to go on, which is a tremendous thing. I don't think any of us really understand what it took to all of a sudden try and have a normal life after you've lost the majority, if not all, of your parents, and you can't go back to the place you were born, and you have to figure out where to go, and you don't know the language, and you have to start from scratch. Very, very difficult. And one of the reasons they didn't talk about it was because if you focus on it too much, then you can't move forward. So they buried it to move forward.
Grief and guilt and all those things tie in very ways that are different for each person. So
absolutely.
like it is a very personal experience. So what one person might be willing to share, as you said, it could be a generation jump. Someone said they lost everyone and was in many labor camps. Very late in life, his wife wrote down some of her experiences. He never spoke of it while raising his family. And that definitely you could see why people wouldn't want to speak about it. But now we know a history, if it's not documented in some way, it gets lost. And
Well,
if
they
keepers
have been
history,
able to document a lot. They have a lot.
yes.
I mean, like Steven Spielberg is one example, but there are other organizations that have done interviews with survivors. So there is a lot, but whatever additional information can be gotten, I think is really important.
Are there any historical societies, genealogy groups, or archives in the US that would be a good place to point to if people want to do more?
There's something called the Jewish Genealogy Society, um, functions in New York. Um, just Google them, you can find them. Um, if they don't have information, they could probably point you to someplace else, and you can certainly try the museums, the one in Washington, the one in New York, the I think it's called the Jewish Heritage Museum, any place like that, would probably have information. And once you establish a link with someone, that usually leads you to another link somewhere else, and hopefully you can find out something. And then sometimes you can't, so you could try.
Genealogy and finding those historical things following your family. You never know. The path could be clear and then it's blocked, but all we can do is try to get that information and save it for our families. Someone said the Shoah Foundation at University of Southern California might also be another one to look
Yes,
at for those kinds of
absolutely.
things.
Yep.
U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So yeah, we luckily we do have some great research. So thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing this important part of history. So we hope to see you at a future event, and everyone have a great evening and be well.
Good
Bye,
night.
everyone. Good night.